Hello there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Bari Norman, and while everybody is queuing into the room, I'll do some brief introductions and talk about some housekeeping items, and then we're going to get right to our conversation about transfer admission. So tonight we have with us Liz Whitby, an associate director at the University of Miami. And so thank you, Liz, for being with us. And we also have Annie Weilson from NYU, also an associate director. And we're going to be talking, as I said, about transfer admission. We were saying, we know that this is a process that isn't spoken about as much as the first year application process. And so our hope is that we can provide some clarity and some direction for those who may be thinking about transfer admission. Housekeeping items, just really quickly. We have questions that came in advance. Thank you so much for submitting them. You'll hear a lot of them come up over the course of our conversation. If anything comes up that you'd like to ask, please pop it into the Q&A section as opposed to the chat. I'm going to keep a little bit closer eye on the Q&A. So if you could do it there, we appreciate it. And without further ado, we will get started. People are still coming in, but I think it's slowed down a little bit. So again, thank you, Annie, and thank you, Liz, for being with us tonight. I really appreciate it. You're already reading applications for first year and transfer admission, so this is prime time. So thank you for spending it with us. If we could start by just going through the transfer review and evaluation process at each of your schools, I think it would be helpful to give people a sense of what happens to a transfer application in terms of how is it determined, who reads the application, how many reads, is there a committee, sort of the general flow, I would say, of a transfer application. And if we could start with you, Annie, and hear about how it goes at NYU, and then Liz, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. So at NYU, we have 2 points of entry for transfer applicants, the fall and the spring. The vast majority of our programs accept transfer applicants for the fall, while only select programs do for the spring. So that really kind of determines the process. So the application is through the Common App, which hopefully many of you are familiar with at this point, and that goes live August 1st for the entire academic year. So right now we are reviewing transfer applications for spring start. And so that is happening simultaneously with our first year review process. And because our students are starting in the spring, it actually does go by very quickly. So our deadline is November 1st, and we release decisions on a rolling basis throughout the month of November and through to mid-December. So those students are hearing back from us quite quickly and then preparing to come to NYU quite quickly because they start in January. So we all review transfer applications in our office. So the entire admission staff reviews transfer applications, and then we break down into committees based on the program to which you're applying. So at NYU, we have 10 undergraduate schools and colleges. So when applying for transfer admission, you are applying directly to a program at the university. So that very much dictates how we're going to review your application, what we're looking for in the application. So we do that kind of second review with that in mind when we're making a decision. For the fall, very similar process. The deadline is April 1st, but we have a little bit more time. So students hear back from us in April, May, and sometimes early June as well for fall start for admission. So that's just kind of a brief overview of the process. It does get a little bit more nuanced as we're talking about different programs and what we're looking for, but it does get, several set of eyes across every single application, and it really is a team effort to get through.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? You're giving decisions sort of on a rolling basis. Does that mean you would encourage people to get applications in sooner rather than later, or is the order in which you're reading somewhat random, aside from, of course, people who are applying for spring in early or late fall?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you apply does not determine when we read your application. So if you submit your application on August 1st, that doesn't mean you're going to get your decision earlier. So, take your time with your application, submit it when you're ready. Submitting it early does not mean necessarily that you'll get a decision earlier.
Thank you. That's certainly true for the first year process, but helpful to know for the transfer process as well. And then Liz, what about at UM?
was looking for my unmute. So similar to NYU, we have 2 entry points for transfer as well. We have spring transfer as well as fall transfer. I will say for spring, we generally have a lot fewer spaces. So it's a much smaller cohort that we're bringing in. For fall, we're bringing in a fairly large class of transfers. So our deadline for spring is November 1st. Our deadline for fall is April 1st. And we always give priority to those students who have their application complete, including all supporting documents by those due dates. So for as far as the process goes and what we're looking for, we use the Common App as well. I'd say a lot of the review process is based predominantly on the student's performance in college. However, if we have a student who's applying to us early in their college career in their first year, then we will be looking at some of their high school performance. So in that case, we might ask for high school final transcript. We might ask to see either test scores or an additional supplemental essay if as we are test optional right now for transfer. So those are the areas that we're looking. We have about 3 different touch points that the application will go through before it finally lands in our admission committee. So we do have an evaluation team that will go through it and make sure that the every transcripts are all set. They'll help us with the GPAs, kind of translating everything that's coming in from other colleges, because there's so many different ways, shapes, and forms that transcripts are done, semester systems, quarter systems, et cetera. And then it comes to our transfer admission officers. We have 4 in total, and we divide up the transfer population by alphabet. And so we always have a point person for all of the students coming in, and we have an admission committee for transfer. So in the month of November, we'll probably have 2 decision releases, 2 or 3 decision releases for spring start. And then we'll start the process again with the April 1st deadline, releasing our first batch of decisions around that time as well.
Terrific. And going from sort of the more general to something much more specific, just a question about sort of the conservatory level programs that both of your schools are known for. I'm thinking, of course, of Tisch at NYU in particular, Frost at There are others that are also audition or portfolio based, but could you speak a little bit about those programs and not only how likely it might be or how many spaces you tend to have, but just even if it's possible to transfer into those more performance-based programs and also ones that are naturally smaller and more competitive. And maybe if we could start this time with you, Liz, that would be great.
Sure. So we have 2 performance-based programs. One is our Frost School of Music, which is musicians, obviously, all different forms. And then we have our musical theater program, which is actually in our College of Arts and Sciences. Both of them require auditions as part of the application process. So because of that, we're only admitting students to those programs for fall. And saying that, the Frost School of Music has a very early deadline for their fall admission. It's actually December 1st, which is different than the other schools and colleges that have an April 1st deadline. So they actually go through the audition process at the same time as our first year students. So all materials, if a student's interested in the Frost School of Music for any of the majors, they would need to apply for fall as of December 1st of this year. Now, the musical theater program is a little bit different. The one in our College of Arts and Sciences, they have auditions as late as March 1st. And so they are taking transfer applications up until that deadline. So again, it's about a month earlier than our regular transfer deadline, but it does give them a little bit more space to get that application in and to upload their audition.
But there are a reasonable number, we don't need specifics, but a reasonable number of students who can transfer into those programs. It's not something where, you know, almost all are coming in as first years and there's very little room for transfers. Is that right?
Well, in general, they're looking to fill different spaces that they have. So in music and in musical theater, it's very deliberate because they have a certain number of studio space for pianists, for vocalists, for different ensembles. And so when they're looking at the potential candidates, they're looking at the first year students and the transfer students together to see where they need to fill spaces, where there might be some areas where they have quite a bit more open space and others where they're looking for something really specific. So it's not something that would have a general number or quota for transfer students. It's year by year.
That makes sense based on the needs of these particular departments. One
Yeah.
other follow-up question. To what extent is the department involved, or how separate is it? Sort of two separate processes that then come together when it comes to an audition-based program?
For our audition-based programs, the departments are very heavily involved, more so than with any of our other programs, our academic programs. So the audition process is very heavily weighted in the admission process. Of course, we're still looking at the holistic review. So we still need to see that the student is not going to struggle in their academic courses, because they are going to be taking academic courses as well. We also want to see that they have a nice clean history, so no discipline or criminal issues in the past. We're looking at their involvement and their grades, and depending on when they're coming, we may or may not review high school. But in general, if they're a good student and the Frost School of Music feels like they're a good fit, we try to go with what they advise.
Great. And Annie, what about at NYU?
Sure. So we do have two schools at NYU with artistic programs. So the Tisch School of the Arts is one of them, but then there's also the Steinhardt School, which is actually home to many of our music-based programs as well as studio art. So the vast majority of our artistic programs only consider fall transfer applicants, so similar to what Liz was saying. And we do require an audition or a portfolio for all of our artistic programs. Because of that, we do recommend that students actually submit their application a month or a few weeks before the posted deadline, which for the fall is April 1st, because there are additional steps involved to schedule an audition, to submit a portfolio. So we want to make sure that students have enough time to do that by the deadline. In terms of the review process, we do admit transfer students to our artistic programs every year. It is a balance of arts and academics, so both do play a role. And the artistic departments are the ones that are reviewing the artistic piece of the application. My office reviews the academic piece, and then we come together in the end to make that decision. And so something that's unique about our artistic programs is, I said that they're all for fall, but that actually does have one caveat. Our film students actually do start in the summer because they have to be on a specific sequence to catch up with the rest of the students in our film program. So they take one of our sequence classes in the summer and then start full-time in the fall. So that's a little bit unique about transferring to NYU, but we do have space available in our artistic programs. Of course, they are competitive because there are those two application components that we are considering in our review, but it really is just for the fall semester with a few exceptions to that.
Okay. And question also as a follow-up, Annie, I know there'll be people out there wondering about Stern. What is the guidance that you give in terms of students who are interested in Stern? How much space realistically is available? If you could share, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So Stern also only accepts applicants for the fall semester, and transfer admission to Stern admittedly is incredibly competitive because we usually have very few spaces available. And we do have very strict prerequisites for Stern. So if you're looking to transfer to Stern for your sophomore year, we do require Calculus 1 in writing. If you're looking to transfer to Stern starting in your junior year of college, there are actually 5 prerequisites that you need to meet. They either need to be completed or in progress by the time you apply to NYU, and those are usually non-negotiable. So that's really important to know if you are interested in applying to Stern, but our acceptance rate is usually in the very low single digits just because we have very few spaces available every year. So important to know that going into the process.
Thank you. Thank you for your honesty and transparency. We appreciate it. Another question as a follow-up to what we were just talking about for both of you, internal versus external transfers in these programs and even more generally, sometimes students will go in with a certain intention and obviously just naturally switch. Some students go in with the expectation or hope of switching. Can you speak a little bit about sort of maybe the programs where, for instance, like Annie was talking about with Stern, where you kind of should not make that your plan, and if and how the internal versus external transfer process works? And maybe Annie, if you could start as a follow-up to what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always encourage students to apply with the intention of continuing in the program that you're applying to. So we're hoping that students are going into the application with that intention, but we also understand that students change their mind. So internally transferring is possible, and you have to fill out an internal transfer application, which asks a few questions about kind of why you're looking to switch programs, how you've been preparing for your new program, just so we can get a sense of your interest in continuing on with that new school or college. And then we only consider the NYU transcript with the internal transfer process. So we're not looking at high school work, or if you're a transfer student from another institution, your past transfer work, we're really only considering your grades at NYU. Because of that, you do have to spend one complete year in the program to which you were admitted. So you do have to spend an entire year taking classes in your home school where you're admitted before you can start in a new school. The Stern School of Business is also incredibly competitive for internal transfer applicants. So we always like to be transparent about that as well. Again, we have very few spaces available, and our artistic programs can be very competitive for internal transfer too, just because, again, there is that artistic component, and students really do need to be artistically admissible to be competitive for those programs. We, however, do our best to make it possible for students to internally transfer, because we do want you to be happy to be in the program that you want to be in, but sometimes we are limited by space constraints. But I would say artistic programs and the Stern School of Business tend to be the most competitive for internal transfer.
And then what about at
So internal transfer is possible. For the most part, it's fairly seamless. It's not difficult to transfer from one school or college to another. We have similar exceptions to that rule, and that the performance-based programs, you would have to do an audition. And also with our Miami Herbert Business School, we have a calculus requirement as well, which is both for internal and external candidates. So students would have to make sure they had the math sequence completed before they were able to apply as an internal transfer into business. Otherwise, most of the schools and colleges are pretty open to internal transfers. We don't have a time period that they need to wait. They work with their advisor and they fill out a form to apply for that transfer. And with a few exceptions, like our business program, they'll be able to transfer fairly easily. I wouldn't ever advise a first-year student or applicant to apply to one program thinking that they can transfer to another, for a few reasons. First of all of our first-year applicants are reviewed the same. So we know that they might transfer because they might change their mind, and that's natural. So we're making sure that if you're a first-year admitted student, that you're someone who would do well in any of our programs. So there's not like a strategic benefit to try to apply to one program or another with the idea of transferring. Otherwise, there are some programs, of course, that you might have to start from scratch. If you were going to transfer into architecture in your sophomore year, you are going to start with a first-year cohort because you need to start in that first-year design studio. But it's still possible, and they'd still welcome you with open arms.
Great, thank you. And both of you have mentioned in passing as you're responding about high school and the role it plays in the review. Could you speak a little bit about, it sounds like from what both of you, each of you has said, that it may depend on what year you're applying to transfer in, and maybe even by program, but could you clarify the role of a student's high school performance in the transfer review process? And if we could start with you, Liz.
Sure. So high school is considered for students who have fewer than 30 credits since they've graduated high school. So that's kind of our line in the sand as far as whether we require a high school transcript or not. In saying that, a lot of students get confused because they have dual enrollment credits in high school, or they might have AP credits in high school. So they might apply to us after their first semester and say, well, I have 45 credits already. We'll say, yes, but you graduated in May and you've actually only taken 15 on a college campus. So that's where our dividing point is. So a student who's earned and completed at least 30 credits since they graduated high school, so that graduation date that's on their diploma, if they have at least 30 credits earned and completed, then we no longer need to see anything from high school. We don't need a high school transcript. We don't need test scores. The only time we would need it is at the time of enrollment, and it's not evaluative at that point. It's just to prove they graduated high school, kind of like a birth certificate, right? So For students who have fewer than 30 credits, so maybe they're in their first year of college somewhere and they decide it's not for them and they want to come to UM, in that case, we would want to see their final high school transcript. We could ask for SAT or ACT scores, or they have a choice of writing a supplemental essay. So we are test optional. I'd say 9 out of 10 students will select the essay. Also because it might have been a little bit of time before they took their SAT or ACT. So we will look at high school. We want to see a pattern that they've been successful, in rigorous courses, and they're ready to come do the level of work on our campus.
And then Annie, what about for you guys?
Yeah, sure. So we do require a high school transcript for almost all of our transfer applicants. The only exception is if you have earned an associate's degree before you apply, then you don't have to submit a high school transcript. Otherwise, it is part of the review process. In terms of the weight that it holds, it does depend on how much time you've completed on a college campus. So if you are in your first year, we are going to consider high school pretty closely with your first semester college grades, because that is the most recent academic information that we have. But if you've completed more than a year, 2 years, then your college work is going to weigh more heavily in our review, although high school will still be considered as part of that process. In terms of standardized testing, because I know Liz brought that up, so we are test optional for fall 2023. And then beyond that, we're not sure what our policy is going to be, but for transfer students, if you've completed more than 1 year by the time you apply, we are always test optional for students in that situation. So really up to you and kind of what you want us to consider, but the high school transcript is always going to be part of the review unless you have completed your associate's diploma.
Great. And for students who are applying in their first year of college, would it ever be appropriate for them or acceptable for them to submit recommendations from high school people, or do you really want to just see as best they can from their first semester, let's say, of college?
Yeah, so we actually became more flexible with letters of recommendation this year. So for both first years and transfers, actually, we only require one, and it can be from anyone who is in a position of authority. So that could be a teacher, a counselor, coach, director, work supervisor. So really anyone you want to speak on your behalf. So it doesn't have to be a college professor. And if you are still close with a high school teacher when you are applying to transfer, that's fine as well.
What about at UM?
So the letter of recommendation is actually optional for transfer students. We don't require it. Some students feel compelled to send one. They feel like it will help us get better context to who they are, and that's great, but we don't require one. If a student's still early on in their college career and they prefer to have that, favorite high school teacher or a high school counselor who knows them better to send the letter, that's completely acceptable.
Okay, great. And for both of your schools, which are extraordinarily popular, I have no doubt that you see repeat applicants, people who gave it a go in high school who are going to try again once they're in college, either in their first or second year. When a student does show up for a second or third or fourth time, does the prior application, is it automatically brought up as part of their file? And does applying previously have an advantage or disadvantage when a student shows up as a transfer student? And maybe we could start with you, Liz.
So we do, I'd say because of, and this is more of a logistical thing, but because of the system we use for reading applications, we could see about 2 to 3 years back initially if a student's applied before. And then we always do check to see if they have applied before. But we do have a rule that if you have been denied admission, you do need to wait at least 1 full year and earn 30 credits before you're eligible to reapply. So if a student's been denied as a first-year student, they need to wait until fall of their sophomore year before they're eligible to apply. Now, of course, that process starts in their spring semester, but in that case, I'm happy to see students who are giving it another chance. If this is where they want to be in college and they're using another school as a stepping stone to get to us, that's fantastic. We are going to be looking then, we might need to wait until we see spring grades before we can make an admission decision. But we don't have, there's no advantage or disadvantage if a student has applied before. We just make sure that they've met that 1 year and 30 credit minimum before they're eligible to reapply. And really, if they're trying to apply before that, it's not to any advantage to them because their decision's probably going to be the same because there's not that much new information for us to consider.
That makes sense.
So if a student has applied previously, a decision they received in the past has no bearing on a future application. So we can see that they've applied previously, but that won't enter into the conversation in terms of what type of decision they'll receive. Students can carry over documents from a previous application if they'd like. So if they applied already and submitted their high school transcript, they don't have to do it again. We can carry that over similarly with a letter of recommendation. But we'll consider any new information as well. We don't have any restrictions. So if a student is not offered admission as a first year, they can immediately apply to transfer to NYU in the following semester. But we do recommend, kind of similar to what Liz was saying, that they show us new academic work with their application, right? Just so we can be considering some academic growth progression with a new application, but we don't have the restrictions as to when they can apply again.
Thank you. And what about the role of the main essay? This varies, by the way, across the board, like depends on the school, if they even use the main Common App essay for transfer students, if they have a supplement, if the supplemental question is the same as for the first year application. Could you speak a little bit about the role of the essays in your transfer process, just to give a sense, also especially relative to the first year process with which most people will be familiar with? And can we start with you, Annie?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have 2 supplemental essays that are specific to NYU. So our first one maps onto our first year application. So that essay is talking about the community that we have at NYU, our diverse community that we think about in terms of identities that are held by our students, academic disciplines represented, organizations on campus. And that essay asks students to talk a little bit about how they hope to contribute to our community and how they envision themselves as part of our community. And then we have a second essay that kind of just asks them more generally why they're looking to transfer and just kind of walking us a little bit through that journey. Both are relatively short. The first one is around 250 words. The second one is around 400 words. And that's just both a good opportunity for us to get to know the student a little bit better and have an understanding of their academic journey and why they're looking to make a change.
For UM, we have one
you're
essay
muted.
that's, oh, I thought I unmuted.
Oh, there you are.
Okay.
You're back.
So for UM, we have one main essay for transfer. It's similar in that we want to know about why they want to transfer, but specifically to the University of Miami. So that's the gist of the main essay for us. And then there is the supplemental essay, but it's only required of students who are in that under 30 credit range and who are not submitting test scores. And it's the same supplemental essay that we use for our first year students. And it's about resilience. So we use our mascot, Sebastian the ibis, who is, I have to tell the story now, but that's the last bird to leave before a hurricane and the first one to return after the storm. And they're tough and resilient, even though they're about 2 feet tall and really skinny. But we asked the students to tell us about a time in their life where they've had to be resilient and overcome adversity like Sebastian. So we have fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to read so many of them, you might as well.
They do a good job.
In terms of the decisions that students can get as transfer, we're familiar with admit, defer, deny, and that for early, and then admit, waitlist, deny. Can students be deferred or waitlisted to a later pool as transfer students at UM?
So at this point, our current decisions are either admit, deny, or waitlist. Students who are waitlisted do have the opportunity to reapply the next semester if they're not taken off the wait list, unlike those who are denied. It means they're admissible, but we simply don't have space. And I'll give this spring as an example. We have very limited space, so we will probably have a significant wait list. And all of those students would be eligible to apply for and encouraged to apply for the fall semester.
Similarly, we also have admit, deny, and waitlist for transfer students. We don't defer transfer students, though.
Okay. And in terms of credit evaluation, so once a student is admitted, they're going to receive their decision. When would they be told which credits transfer and kind of so they can have a sense of how they're coming in credit-wise? How does that work at NYU?
So when a student is admitted, they get an estimated credit transfer range. And then if they choose to enroll, an academic advisor in their department will then do a deep dive into their college transcript, work with faculty members when appropriate, and then tell them exactly what classes will transfer over to the university. The maximum number that we can transfer over is 64 credits, which is the equivalent of 2 years at NYU. It does vary program to program, and our artistic programs sometimes have a lower credit maximum just because of all of the artistic classes that are required for those programs. The classes that are most likely to transfer over are those general core liberal arts classes, and we can award credit if a student has earned a C or higher in their class.
At similarly, we're looking for a C or higher in academic coursework that is coming from a regionally accredited college or university. So I would say, if you took yoga, that's good for your health, but we're not going to transfer the credit over. And saying that similarly, when students are admitted, they receive a transfer credit evaluation. Some of the courses will be given course by course evaluation if there's some of the basic things like your English composition, etc. But others might need that deeper dive where the student needs to actually get the transfer credit equivalencies approved through the schools and colleges or through the faculty. So at the time of admission, they're given that transfer credit evaluation, the approximate number of credits that will transfer. And then once they enroll, they'll work with their advisor to go get the rest of the credits course by course equivalency. I know students, that's probably the first question they ask. They want to know how many of my classes are going to transfer, how long do I have until graduation, am I a sophomore, a junior? And a lot of those students want that information before they even apply. And that's not something we can share, but I think by using that rule of thumb that if you have a C or higher in the course and it's an academic course, then you're mostly good to go. Will it be the exact equivalent of the class you're taking? Not necessarily, but you will get credit for it. We also require that the students take their last 56 credits in-house if they're transferring from a 2-year university, and their last 45 credits in-house if they're transferring from a 4-year university.
That actually is a good segue to what my follow-up question was going to be. Sometimes students realize a little later than expected that they want to transfer. And so they may have a little bit more than 2 years, let's say, either because they realize they have a different interest or they just need to be in a different place. When a student has more than 60 or 64 credits, can they still come in and just presumably lose some credits as long as they're willing to lose them? Or is it sort of, are you looking at people who might be coming later as sort of being too far in, so to speak, to be realistically competitive?
I can start because I'm unmuted, but we're not going to hold anybody at a disadvantage if they have a lot of credits. We have students who are coming into us and wanting to do second bachelor's degrees. So sometimes we'll have students who have 120 credits, they're applying, and some of those credits will go as, course gen ed requirements for their new bachelor's degree. And so for us, that's okay. They'll just need those, like I said, final 45 credits in our school, in the University of Miami. So we don't have a problem with it. They might come and instead of graduating with 120 credits, they're graduating with 130 credits, and that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, similarly, those students are welcome to apply to NYU, but because they have to spend at least 2 years at NYU to complete their degree, depending on how much time they've completed at their prior institution before coming to NYU, they likely would have to forfeit quite a few credits and be comfortable with that if they accept their offer of admission, but they are welcome to apply.
Okay, so as long as they're comfortable, it's workable. And then Annie, follow-up question that came in from one of our audience members. With regard to the Stern prerequisites, particularly when you're coming in later and there's 5 courses, if you're current institution, let's say, doesn't offer one of them, presumably, if you were aware that you wanted to make this transfer, you might be able to take it in the summer at a different institution. I'm assuming that's part of the answer. Anything else if you're at an institution where they don't have financial accounting or something very specific that you require?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And, we never want to disadvantage a student if they don't have access to that course. So in those cases, we would just ask students to give us that information in the additional information section of the common application. That way we can take that into consideration when reviewing their application. After submitting their application, applicants to STIRD actually get access to a prerequisites form, and they actually have to list all the classes that they've taken towards those prerequisites. So if there's a class that you think meets the prerequisite but has a slightly different name, you can include that course there and let us know that that's the course you've taken to fulfill that prerequisite. Going back a little bit to what Liz was saying about kind of reviewing transfer credits in advance, we also are not able to review transfer credits in advance, but if a student is applying to STIRN because they are so strict with their prerequisites, we can take a look at classes that they want to take towards the prerequisites to make sure that they meet our requirements.
Thank you. That's actually very helpful, especially because they're so specific. If we could switch gears a little bit and talk a bit more broadly about the transfer pools and maybe even some statistics if you have them. Both of you read both transfer and first-year applications, and I'd be curious to hear how those pools, in whatever way you might describe, like how are they different? Sort of if you were describing them more generally. And if we could start with you, Annie.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is for first-year students, we always know how much space we'll have available for students in the class that we're enrolling. For transfer students, it varies widely semester to semester based on the space available in our programs. So that is the biggest difference between the two pools. Also, the rolling admissions is very different. So for first years, we have a set deadline and notification date. For transfer students, as I mentioned earlier, we're sending decisions out usually on a weekly basis across 2 or 3 months. And then in terms of kind of the acceptance rate, so we don't publish acceptance rates for our transfer pools because they're not really all that helpful since it varies drastically from semester to semester. So I know a lot of students are asking, what's your average GPA? What's your average acceptance rate for transfers? And unfortunately, there's just not a good number that we can give because it is so dependent on the space that we have in our programs and our applicant pool for that semester. So I would say that's really the biggest difference, is the space available dictating what we can do with the pool of applicants.
On average, in terms of the academic profile, and obviously it's a little bit different coming out of high school than college, but in as much as we can kind of equate them, would you say it's a similar academic profile for both pools? Is one a bit more flexible or less flexible?
Yeah, it really depends, but I would say academically, we are seeing similar academic credentials across first years and transfers. So strong high school and strong college for our transfer students for the vast majority of our programs. The academic profile might vary slightly because of the pools and the space available, but we are still very academically driven in our transfer review process. And that really is the crux of our review at the end of the day, with the exception of artistic programs where it is that balance of artistic and academic elements.
Sure. And what about at UM?
So I'd say comparing first year to transfer is definitely that apples and oranges analogy. With our first year application pool, we had nearly 50,000 applications last year and a 19% acceptance rate. Transfer is like a microcosm of that as far as quantity. And it's just a different animal altogether. So with transfer, we're mostly focusing on their performance in college. We want to see, are they going to be successful on our campus? Of course, we don't want to put anyone in a position where they're struggling. So that pattern of strong grades generally is what we're looking for. I also don't have a published acceptance rate for transfer. It does vary. Actually semesters to semesters. So this spring will be significantly different than our fall pool. In saying that, we do say that to be competitive for admission, at least you should have a 3.0 GPA. To be competitive for our transfer scholarship, you should have at least a 3.5 GPA. And then after that, it's the rest of the holistic review that we're using to make our admission decisions.
And a lot of people have been asking about and just sort of there's sort of the chatter about pre-pandemic and post-pandemic transfer rates. Certainly in that first fall after in 2020, so many students were not happy wherever they were because it was a tough time to be a first-year student in college. And so is it the case that both pre and post-pandemic, but especially in that sort of year of the 2020 to 2021, did you see an increase in applicants for transfer? Has that is that still kind of moving? Has it leveled out? I'm just curious about that. We can start with you, Liz.
Yeah, so we've seen an increase in transfer applications over the past few years. However, I wouldn't necessarily chalk it up to the pandemic because we have seen that same increase in our first year applications. So it's just following the same trend. If it's COVID related or not, it's hard to say because it is going in both areas. There has been a difference.
Yeah, I would say there hasn't been a significant difference for us in transfer applications pre and post pandemic. Maybe the only trend I can point to is we do have a few opportunities for students to get a second bachelor's degree, and we did see a lot of interest in nursing after the pandemic, which was great to see because, of course, we always need more folks in the nursing field, but the application numbers didn't look very different pre and post pandemic, so we didn't see a huge trend there.
That's interesting. I don't think that's the public perception for sure. I think it felt like there was a lot more movement, perhaps, so that's helpful to hear. And then in terms of just also getting a sense of on average, and I know one of the things that we've clearly heard from you is that it depends on, programs and semester, and there are a lot of factors, but if you could say on average how big a transfer class is, even for a year on average, how many students you bring in as transfers, or whatever you can share as close to that. Could you give us a sense, Annie, at NYU, how it is?
Yeah, we usually have a few hundred transfer students every year across our programs, which much smaller than our first year class, which is around 5,500 to 6,000 at this point. So it's usually a few hundred across all the programs.
At our transfer cohorts differ between spring and fall.
Sorry, could you say again? It also, the mic took a second.
Sure. So at our transfer cohorts and new students differs between spring and fall. Again, for the spring, we'll welcome a very small handful of new transfer students, and by small handful, double digits, but probably under 50, under 40. For this fall, however, we'll have usually around the 500 mark. It changes from year to year. Our target will change year to year depending on the first year class coming in, but I'd say it's around the 400 to 500 mark of new transfers coming in the fall.
Great. And what about the most popular entry point? Is it students coming in as sophomores, students coming in as juniors, people basically who have been kind of just a year in college or halfway through the year when they're applying versus having a little bit more time? Do you see a bigger, like a larger representation for students coming in second versus third year?
I can start. I'd say there's two different groups. So we have the students who are going to two-year colleges and want to finish their associate's degrees before they transfer. So that's their plan of attack from the beginning, which is great. It makes a lot of sense. And then we have students who will go to another four-year institution and they decide it's not for them and they want to transfer. And that might be after any given amount of time. So it could be after a semester, it could be after a year. But I'd say that the ones who are transferring after 2 years, it's usually because they're trying to complete that associate's degree first.
I would say we definitely see a blend of both. I don't know that it really trends either direction. It's pretty evenly split. So we see some students transferring after their first year and also many students transferring after their second year. And then, of course, we have transfer students that are coming to us from a variety of different points in their life as well.
Mhm. And then once students arrive on campus, is there like sometimes we get the question about just sort of easing in to a new campus for when a lot of social groups and kind of connections are already solidified or in process. And is there any kind of orientation for transfer students? Both of your schools are in places where the housing market is tight. How does it work for housing? If you could just give a sense of what kind of resources might be available for a student coming in sort of midstream. And we'll start with you, Annie.
Sure. So all of our students have NYU Welcome, and we actually have it for both the fall and the spring semester. And NYU Welcome is just a series of programming that happens on and off campus. So that includes academic orientations, meeting with advisors, but also just fun events on campus too. That's when we have our club fest, so they can be introduced to all the clubs and organizations on campus. So regardless if they're starting in the fall or spring, they do have that welcome event on campus to become acclimated to NYU and being in New York City. For housing is not guaranteed for transfer students, though we do our best to be able to provide that. And in terms of finding communities on campus, so they're welcome to join any of our clubs or organizations, but we do have some communities that are specific to transfer students as well, so they can meet other students who are experiencing similar things to them. So we do have some transfer student leaders, transfer communities, and then of course our NYU Welcome, which is the entire NYU community coming together. So I think pretty quickly they're brought into the fold there.
Great.
Can I say ditto? It's almost exactly the same. So we call ours Cane Kickoff, and Cane Kickoff happens in the spring and the fall. We have special programming within the orientation week that is specific to transfer students. So they will actually get connected with a current transfer student who acts as a mentor for them. So we do have a transfer student organization. We also have a transfer student honor society, and they're very active. They're actually very socially active as well. And they really try to embrace the new students coming in, so they feel very much like part of the community from the get-go. There are some social media sites that some of the students have put together, as well as this transfer student organization. So I joined it myself just because I'm nosy, and but they're always chatty. So there's a lot of stuff going on, students trying to meet each other before they get to campus. Similarly, as far as housing goes, we neither guarantee nor require housing for transfer students, but they'll again within these different groups connect with each other to rent apartments nearby or houses nearby. We also have an off-campus housing website that works with students and connects them to different areas nearby campus that are either walking, biking, or short drive to campus.
Yeah, and it's helpful, I think, for both of you at your schools. There's, a few to several hundred students coming in at a time, which I think also gives you, it's not just a small cohort, it's sizable. So that gives people more opportunity to form community and not to feel as isolated, which is nice.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. As I said, I know it's such an incredibly busy time for both of you. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to share the insights and for your honesty and transparency, which is the most helpful. So thank you so very much. Thank you to everybody watching and joining us this evening, and wishing everybody the best of luck with this upcoming cycle.